Hello, I'm Ciarán Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. With mating finished up on the majority of lowland farms, our attention turns to an often overlooked area of ewe management, and that's management during mid-pregnancy. To discuss its importance, I'm joined by Professor Tommy Boland from UCD. Tommy starts off by discussing the importance of assessing ewe condition. Why is it a key management tool, but one that's often overlooked at farm level? He discusses the variation in ewe condition we see within flocks and the importance of managing a ewe's body reserves during this period. We'll discuss the effects of ewe condition, particularly on performance during early lactation, and the potential carryover effects for the rest of the season. We finish up discussing flock management during the coming weeks, with Tommy offering his views on the need to address any deficit in ewe condition before ewes enter late pregnancy. We start off, however, with Tommy highlighting its importance at this key stage of the season.
We're focusing on the ewe condition during mid-pregnancy, and I think it's sometimes an area that's overlooked. We're all quite conscious of what happens in late pregnancy, and we're certainly all probably conscious of what happens in the lead up to mating. And sometimes that window in between up to mid-pregnancy can be forgotten about. Partly because it's the time of the year and, we can use our ewes on the farm as kind of a clean-up tool at that stage, but it's important that we don't forget about managing the ewes during that window. And I suppose with ewe nutrition and with management of body condition score, it all depends on your starting point. And if we have our ewes in the correct condition at mating time, then it really will influence how we can manage those ewes from mating up to mid-pregnancy.
Like you mentioned condition score there, Tommy. We widely acknowledge it's probably one of the most useful practical tools for managing a flock, but it's not really put into practice in a lot of cases. You were involved in a study a number of years ago, Seaward, that looked at that in a bit more detail, but we know the uptake of it is not great.
Yeah, that's right. When Alan Bohan conducted his PhD thesis, he travelled around to farmer discussion groups and he did a really thorough survey of management practices on farm. And if bear in mind, these are farmers who are engaged with discussion groups, and only about 2/3 of those farmers are actually measuring body condition score on their flock on a routine basis, which certainly surprised me at the time for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's free technology. It's something you can do. You don't need to have expensive equipment. You don't need to buy a supplement to do it. So it's a free technology. And I think, there's a lot of evidence from right around the world to show that, if you can improve your body condition score of your flock, that you will see production responses. You will see a better output as a result of doing that. And the third point I'd say about body condition scoring and targets then, Ciarán, is that we often talk about an average, and we say we need our ewes to have an average body condition score at mating of 3.5. But we also need to be conscious of the variation in body condition score within the ewe flock. And it's really that lighter cohort, or the cohort of ewes which are in poorer condition, that we should probably start looking at for a little bit of, I suppose, preferential treatment, or treating them somewhat separately to the remainder of the flock.
Essentially, Tommy, from the period from now up until scanning time, the aim really, I suppose, most farms should be to minimise the amount of condition score loss and trying to maintain it as much as possible.
Yes, I would agree with that, Ciarán. Some work from the UK conducted in the 90s and perhaps a little bit earlier back into the 80s would show that where ewes lose body condition score in mid-pregnancy, it can have a beneficial effect on placental development, which is subsequently going to improve lamb birth weight. Unfortunately, what's often lost in that message is the fact that the ewe must be in a target body condition score of 3.5 at mating. Then, over the second and third month of pregnancy, it is acceptable to allow that ewe to gradually lose half a body condition score. However, we need to be very careful about putting that forward as an industry-wide recommendation, because if that ewe is not in the target body condition score of 3.5 at mating, then actually having that ewe or having a flock of ewes lose body condition score in mid-pregnancy will be detrimental on the outcome for both the ewe and the lamb.
And it's fair to say in that scenario as well, that's a ewe that has condition obviously to begin with, but that's also a ewe whose nutritional requirements are being met during late pregnancy.
Yes, and you bring in an important point there with the late pregnancy nutrition, and we all know that late pregnancy is a time of huge demand for the ewe in terms of our energy requirements and our protein requirements. And what I would be very keen to do is whatever body condition and whatever body reserves that ewe has at scanning time, that they're maintained through the late pregnancy period and they're available to the ewe to utilize in early lactation. And those body reserves will have a really important role to play in early lactation. If we burn those off through late pregnancy, then they're not going to be there for lactation. If they're not there for early lactation, one of two things will happen. We will either have to feed concentrates and quite a lot of concentrates to optimize lamb performance, or if we don't feed concentrates, then lamb performance is going to suffer.
I'm thinking in terms of that, like there's a whole other idea with condition score that it can be a vicious cycle. If you lose it, it's difficult to put on, as we know, particularly at this stage of the season. But we'll take that scenario you outlined. If you don't have it at Lambton and we have that negative consequence, the carryover effect of that on the following season as well, Tommy, like it's not just in many cases a one-off, I got it wrong this year. There is a bit of a knock-on effect in some of these cases.
There is, and there's a knock-on effect, I suppose, in two ways, Ciarán. First of all, if you don't have that body reserve in the ewe to mobilize in early lactation, and you're not feeding concentrates to the ewe, then her milk production potential is reduced. And again, there's loads of data to support that, the importance of having body reserves in early lactation. If you take a 80 kilogram ewe who's mobilizing 100 grams of body weight per day in early lactation, that's equivalent to about 250 grams of concentrates. So it's a really important energy reserve. If that's not there, her milk production is negatively impacted, which means her lamb growth rate is negatively impacted. So what's the knock-on effect of that? Those lambs are going to be on your farm for longer, because that young lamb, that's the most efficient animal on any sheep farm. So if you don't capture that growth potential at that stage, it could take you 4, 5, 6 times longer in September and October to achieve the same amount of gain as it does in the first month of pregnancy. So you have your lambs then in the back end competing with your ewes for grass reserves. And then the second problem, if you burn off those reserves in late pregnancy and they're not there in lactation, the ewe is under more pressure to support lamb performance, so she continues to lose reserves, placing her in a very poor body condition score at mating time, making it much more difficult for her to recover placing her in a low body condition score at weaning time, placing her under much more pressure to recover her body reserves for the subsequent mating, meaning that potentially her litter size in that subsequent mating is reduced, or she falls out of the flock because she doesn't become pregnant.
There's carryover implications in that. If we bring it back to the current context, it's something else you mentioned earlier. Typically at this stage of year, it's a low input time on farms. Most of the lambs are moved off it when the ewes are out cleaning up farms, many mixed farms around the country, other way at grass. That taking eye off the ball happens at this time of year. It's one of the pitfalls. Just in terms of meat requirements, in difficult winters, we'll often say, particularly in wet winters, it can be difficult enough to meet requirements. Or maybe we expect too much off the ground we put sheep to. How big of an impact, Tommy, does that have as a whole flock context? But maybe you mentioned like that vulnerable group in that scenario. The older ewe, the broken mouth ewe, or maybe a thin hogget coming in that wasn't in ideal condition at joining.
Yeah, so I suppose that if you would call that vulnerable group, but that group that may require some preferential treatment, there's a couple of issues there, Ciarán. The first thing is to identify them, okay? And if you have animals which are a little bit under conditioned at mating, the opportunity to gain condition in those animals occurs kind of up to about day 100 of pregnancy. That's up roughly around the time you would scan the ewes. After that, you have very limited opportunities to allow those ewes to gain condition, simply because the requirements for the lamb in late pregnancy are so high that you really have to go in with a very high level of feeding to allow that ewe to gain condition. So the window is between kind of mating and that scanning time. There's two other things that play then when it comes to the nutritional value in our grass at this time of the year. And perennial ryegrass and grass, they're fantastic plants and fantastic feeds, but they do lose some of their energy value as the season progresses. So from about August, September onwards, the energy content in those grasses will naturally decline. And then if you combine that with the very wet weather we've been having in the last month or 6 weeks, at least over my side of the country, you're going to reduce grass utilisation. And we have some work that your colleague Frank Campy conducted up in Lyons a few years ago, which showed that when grass is very wet, so you have 2 or 3 days of continuous rainfall, the intake capacity of the yoke can be reduced by as much as 33%. So we need to be very careful that we're not asking our yoke or expecting too much of our yoke at this time of the year when it's wet, when grass quality has deteriorated, and when grass utilisation is also quite low due to the fact that soil conditions are starting to cut up underfoot, and you're leading to siling of the grass and reduce the intake from that direction.
So at this stage, it's very much a case of going through that flock and maybe coming up with a separate management plan for those thinner ewes. So the whole fit, thin, fat argument. There is an argument going in at the moment of isolating them thinner ewes and perhaps housing them earlier, Tommy, or certainly maybe not pushing them as tight at this stage of the season.
Yeah, and listen here, we all strive for simplicity in our production systems, and we don't want to be generating unnecessary additional groups on farm, but I wouldn't see this as an unnecessary additional group. There's huge kind of performance benefits to be achieved and economic benefits to be obtained by targeting that, lower 25-30% of the flock. So whatever mechanism applies at an individual farm level to prioritize those animals, give them some additional feeding, it should be applied. On some farms that might be housing. On some farms it might be, kind of using almost a leader follower system where the sheep get the thinner sheep get priority access to the new break of grass, and then the larger cohort come in behind them and clean up. Or it may even result in some concentrate supplementation at farm level. It's up to each farmer to identify what works best on their farm. But the data and the experience and the evidence shows that if you preferentially target that bottom performing cohort of the flock, that you will see production and performance benefits as a result.
And I suppose the key point in that is there is still a window between now and scanning to address some of them issues.
There absolutely is, and as I said before, now is the time to address it. Once you get into the last 2 months of pregnancy, trying to gain condition, you really have to go very heavy with the feeding, which can lead to other problems as well if you don't gain that condition now in the first half of pregnancy.
Tommy, great to get your insights on the whole topic. Plenty to focus on for the coming weeks for farmers.
Thanks, Ciarán. Good to chat to you.
Okay, we'll have to finish things up at this point. Again, as Tommy highlighted, assessing yoke condition is one of the most useful management tools you have at farm level. Taking an example at the moment of assessing yoke condition, putting a plan in place to deal with some of them thinner ewes, whether it be preferential grazing, earlier supplementation, earlier housing, it will pay dividends in the long run, both in terms of performance, health of the sheep and overall profitability for your flock. Certainly, it's well worthwhile practice. I would like to thank Tommy again for sharing his insights with us, great deal of experience in the area, and I'd like to thank him for giving up his time to be with us for this podcast. That's it for me. For any updates from the sheep programme, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Ciarán Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and listen in to any of our episodes.